For decades, the world watched Russia's armored legions roll across Red Square as a symbol of unshakable power. But in 2025, on the battlefields of Ukraine, that symbol is crumbling into rust. Lacking modern tanks, Moscow has opened the tombs of the Soviet Union and brought back machines from the Cold War. These zombie tanks are the portrait of a collapsing superpower, struggling to survive on the past. Today, you'll see the satellite images the Kremlin doesn't want the world to see, and understand why Putin's army is fighting a war it can no longer win. When the images first began to circulate, many thought they were fake. Amid the devastated fields of Donbass and the repair yards in Belgorod, tanks that looked like they had come straight out of a museum started to appear in formation. The scrap metal of the Soviet era was back in action, and that exposes an uncomfortable truth. The doctrine that was once the pride of the Red Army is now collapsing. In Russian military strategy, armored vehicles have always been the heart of the offensive. Since World War II, Moscow has built its entire doctrine around the breakthrough power of tanks. Every offensive, every lightning advance, from Afghanistan to Chechnya, depended on columns of steel pushing forward and crushing resistance. Russia has always believed wars are won through mass and weight. More tanks, more cannons, more firepower. That mindset shaped not just the battlefield, but the very identity of the Kremlin itself. To Moscow, an army without modern tanks is an army without a soul. But Ukraine shattered that illusion with cold, hard numbers. In less than 2 years of war, Russia has lost over 3,500 confirmed armored vehicles, including hundreds of T-72B3, T-80U, and T-90M tanks, the most advanced in its fleet. Satellite images show fields of burned metal scattered across eastern Ukraine, scorched hulls, turrets torn off, entire columns wiped out by drones, mines, and anti-tank missiles. Each loss is more than a statistic. It's the erosion of Russia's offensive capability, the death of the idea that its mechanized forces could ever dominate the battlefield again. The impact has been devastating. Factories in Nizhny Tagil and Omsk can't replace even a third of what's being lost in combat. Russia's defense industry, choked by sanctions and the lack of imported components, is literally tearing down old vehicles to cannibalize parts. The production lines that once rolled out hundreds of tanks a year now operate in emergency mode, often rebuilding the hulls of T-62s and T-55s, vehicles designed in the 1950s and 60s, and sending them back to war with improvised armor plates and outdated optical systems. And that's where the term coined by Russian soldiers themselves comes from: zombie tanks. Machines that should have stayed dead, forcibly resurrected for a war that demands technology, not nostalgia. These armored corpses represent not just a shortage of material, but the desperation of an army fighting with the past and losing in the present. And if Russia is digging up its own mechanical graves, the question now is, what exactly is it bringing back to life? The answer to that question can be found in the latest satellite images of the 111th Central Tank Reserve Base in Buryatia, eastern Siberia. For decades, this place was a kind of armored graveyard, a steel cemetery where thousands of Soviet-era tanks rested under the snow, preserved only by the cold. But now, something has changed. Satellite images, captured by commercial sensors between February and September of 2025, show a brutal transformation. Entire rows of T-62s, T-55s, and even T-54s have vanished from their neatly aligned positions. In place of the regular shadows of hulls and turrets, there are dark patches of mud and fresh track marks. The clearings reveal what analysts call mass extraction. Vehicles being hastily pulled out and sent to military workshops, many in conditions bordering on the absurd. From a distance, it looks like the rebirth of an army. Up close, it's the autopsy of its fleet, because the condition of these vehicles is simply catastrophic. The rusted shells show corroded hulls, fossilized hydraulic systems, expired ammunition, and engines that won't start even with fresh fuel. Some tanks have literally been claimed by nature, covered in moss, roots, and deep corrosion. Others, their turrets sealed shut by rust, had to be cut open with blowtorches just so maintenance crews could reach the inside. From afar, the convoys leaving the base look like a massive logistical effort. Up close, it's an act of desperation, an attempt to turn scrap metal into firepower. The reality is that less than half of these armored vehicles have any chance of returning to service. The rest become donors, parts sacrificed so that others can move, shoot, and maybe survive a few weeks on the battlefield. This process is known as cannibalization, and it has become routine for Russia's armored forces. A tank needs a new fire control system. It gets the sight ripped from another one. The engine burned out. It's replaced with one from 1967 that still works. Damaged armor plates? They're patched with improvised naval steel, sometimes even doors taken from civilian vehicles. The result is a metal Frankenstein, a hybrid tank that combines parts from different models, eras, and technologies, assembled under improvised conditions in military workshops in the Caucasus, in Belgorod, and even inside tractor factories hastily converted for wartime use. Russian mechanics have nicknamed this process selective resurrection, a bitter irony to describe the act of choosing which machine lives and which becomes food for the others. But even when one of these tanks finally comes back to life, the cost is high. Without modern sensors, without effective reactive armor, and with structural weaknesses built up over decades, they become easy prey for Ukrainian drones and anti-tank missiles. The crews know it. Many soldiers have been seen painting crosses or grim nicknames on their vehicles before heading to the front, a gesture closer to farewell than to battle readiness. And what the satellite images don't show, field footage confirms. Entire convoys of resurrected T-62s being destroyed within minutes by low-cost FPV drones that cost less than the fuel required just to start one of those tanks. It's a cruel symbol of modern warfare. Russia spends weeks restoring a 40-ton vehicle, and Ukraine wipes it out with an 8-kilogram drone. The armored colossus that once symbolized Moscow's might now survives by tearing pieces off itself. The 111th Reserve Base, once a repository of past glories, has become a field of autopsies, where the past is dismantled piece by piece to keep alive the illusion of strength. And if the Russian army is willing to fight with ghosts of iron, the next question is inevitable. How do these tanks perform once they finally reach the battlefield? These ghosts of iron reach the battlefield and turn into numbers. And it's those numbers that reveal the true scale of Russia's armored collapse. According to open-source intelligence databases, which only count losses confirmed by photos or videos, more than 3,600 Russian tanks have been destroyed, damaged, captured, or abandoned since the start of the invasion. That doesn't even include the thousands of infantry fighting vehicles, self-propelled artillery pieces, and light armored vehicles that have disappeared under Ukrainian fire. Each geolocated image is a final verdict against the myth of Moscow's mechanized invincibility. Ukraine's general staff publishes even higher figures, claiming it has eliminated over 10,000 tanks in total, combining various classes of armored vehicles. It's propaganda, yes, but even cutting that number in half, the picture remains the same. Russia is losing armor faster than its industry can replace it. Reports from the International Institute for Strategic Studies show that in 2024 alone, Moscow lost more than 1,400 tanks and nearly 4,000 infantry fighting vehicles. That's the equivalent of the entire operational stock of several NATO armies lost in just 12 months of war. And what's even more alarming is that Russian factories can't replace even a fraction of those losses. Uralvagonzavod, the plant responsible for producing the T-90, has increased output to somewhere between 150 and 200 units per year, yet it still relies on cannibalizing old T-90A and T-72 hulls to assemble modernized versions. The result is that every new tank arriving at the front is already outdated, a collage of Soviet-era parts mixed with makeshift electronics. Even at maximum capacity, Russia can only produce or upgrade a few hundred tanks per year, while losing thousands in the same period. The math doesn't work. The Soviet stockpile is running dry, and each vehicle resurrected from reserve bases marks one step closer to the end of the line. Analysts from the Royal United Services Institute warn that at this pace, the Kremlin could completely deplete its armored reserves in less than 2 years, relying almost entirely on current production, and without the means to sustain it under sanctions and component shortages. In other words, time is working against Moscow. The mechanized war it created is now devouring its own tanks. And while Russia tries to replace its losses with scrap metal painted olive green, Ukrainian drones keep hunting down every new resurrected machine on the battlefield. But the question remains, when these tanks finally reach real combat, what can they actually do? When an army starts digging into the past for solutions, it's a clear sign that the present is already out of control. And that's exactly what's happening with Moscow's forces. Without modern armor, without enough vehicles, and with production lines stretched to the limit, the Kremlin has resorted to measures that border on the absurd, some straight out of a history book. In recent weeks, field reports and local videos have shown something no one expected to see in the 21st century. Russia reactivating mounted cavalry units. Yes, horses. Animals being used for transport in areas where armored vehicles have been destroyed or can't operate because of mud, lack of fuel, or shortage of spare parts. Russian officers justified the move by saying that cavalry is silent and adaptable, but in reality it exposes the depth of the logistical collapse. A horse can cross a minefield, but it can't face an FPV drone. That image, soldiers with modern rifles riding pack animals, has become a tragic symbol of a power that's retreating decades into its own military past. And while it tries to revive the cavalry, Russia's Ministry of Defense faces another problem: what to do with the leftover scrap metal. Several open-source investigations have revealed that destroyed tanks and vehicles are being sold as junk at regional auctions by companies tied to local oligarchs. In regions like Kursk and Belgorod, burned-out T-72s and BMPs have been piled up and sold by weight, the same fate as machines that, until recently, were considered the core of Russia's ground forces. The country that once built more tanks than any other nation on Earth is now trading them as scrap metal. This brutal shortage of armor is reshaping Russian tactics on the front. Without tanks to break through defenses, the army has turned to mass infantry assaults, waves of soldiers sent on foot, often without mechanized cover, trying to capture Ukrainian positions through sheer exhaustion. It's a tactic from another century, brutal and inefficient, that has cost thousands of lives since the war began. Western intelligence sources report that in some offensives, the casualty ratio reaches 10 soldiers killed for every position captured. The goal is no longer to win quickly, but to wear down the enemy through the force of bodies. Without tanks, Russia is trying to win with flesh. And that says everything about the real state of its army. The mechanized power that was once the pride of Soviet doctrine has turned into a patchwork of improvisation. Horses, scrap metal, and soldiers thrown into battle as substitutes for machines that no longer exist. But that strategy comes with a price, and it's closing in fast. Because every tank lost, every failed offensive, and every wasted human assault pushes the Kremlin one step closer to the point of no return. In the end, what we're witnessing isn't just the decay of Russia's armored forces, it's the collapse of an entire model of power. The doctrine that for decades sustained the myth of Moscow's mechanized strength is now unraveling in front of cameras and satellites. The numbers are undeniable: thousands of tanks lost, production lines unable to replace what's destroyed, and storage depots almost empty. To mask the disaster, the Kremlin is resurrecting Soviet-era tanks, dismantling some to salvage others, and sending soldiers on horseback into a war dominated by drones and guided missiles. Russia, once the symbol of modern warfare, is now fighting with the shadows of its past. And that comes at a cost that goes far beyond the battlefield. It corrodes the image of a superpower, drains the economy, demoralizes its troops, and exposes the fragility of an empire literally disintegrating from the inside out. If what we see today is Russia trying to survive with what's left of its arsenal, the question is, what will remain of its military capability once even these zombie tanks are gone? Share your thoughts in the comments. And if you found it astonishing to see Russia digging up tanks from the Cold War, wait until you see what's happening on the other side of the world. While Moscow struggles to survive on the past, China just realized that the future has already surrounded it. The United States and its allies are building an invisible wall of missiles across the Pacific, and it's about to completely change the rules of the game. Click now on the video. China's Navy just realized they're trapped, US built an invisible missile wall, and see how Australia, with new HIMARS systems and precision missiles, is reshaping the balance of military power on the planet. See you there.